Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Today I have the pleasure of having with me Jennifer Griffiths, and we're going to talk about transferable skills analysis and employability analysis. And we have a lot to talk about. And so first of all, a few words about myself, Francois Paradis. I'm a vocational evaluator in Toronto. I've been practicing for over 20 years and specializing in forensic vocational evaluation. And I'm also chair of professional development for KVOS, our professional association in Canada. And as I said, I have Jennifer Griffiths with me today. And Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Francois. I'm Jennifer Griffiths. I'm so excited and pleased to be here today. TSAs are like my lifeblood. I'm knee deep in TSAs on a regular basis. I've been working in the VR field for over 25 years. I've been in vocational for most of that time. And I've done a lot of work around actually service provision. So doing TSAs myself and then also supervising a lot of people that are doing TSA. So I've been on both sides. And also in the last few years, I've also been specializing in forensic vocational evaluation.
yes.
And I volunteer with the KVOS Society. I'm on the board. I have been for I think it's about 6 or 7 years, and I'm now moving into, I'm the president-elect, so I will be president next year, and I'm really excited about that role. So thanks so much for inviting me.
Sure. And also that you are soon to release a module on
Right.
advanced TSA. That will come out eventually, but that's also very interesting. I think people will look forward to that as well.
Yeah, I don't know how I could forget that. It's also been it's been a labor of love, and we're working on the final touches on that. So I'll be very excited to release that module. Be with the VRA Online Learning Academy, and it'll be called Advanced Transferable Skills. So look for that soon.
That sounds good. Okay, so let's start right away. Briefly, I'll talk about our learning outcomes today. It's a selection of topics and practical applications of TSAs. So for one thing, we'll talk about informed consent and the importance of reviewing employment history as you do a TSA. And another section will be discussing unadjusted and adjusted composite profile. What is it? What does that mean? And we'll talk about the important step of matching the profile with occupations and what are the potential difficulties there. And we'll talk a little bit about tools of the trade. For example, software, TSA software. What are the benefits, the drawbacks of using a software? And we'll also discuss selected issues in report writing. So, like I said, a lot of material to cover. So we'll start right away with informed consent. So there are a few issues to discuss when we want to get informed consent. First of all, what do we mean by informed consent? We mean that your client, the evaluee, should be aware of what service is being provided, what are the implications, the purpose, what is your role as an assessor. And sometimes the client is not a willing participant. So it is crucial to have a good discussion first with your client, make sure that they at least understand what they're getting into. And another side benefit of that is that you can improve participation. If they're willing, if they know what they're getting into, they're more likely to provide the information you need. And also, consent can be implied, or expressed consent. So implied consent would be someone just showing up for the meeting and nodding his head or her head. And consent can be also expressed verbally, just saying, yes, I agree. But the gold standards, and that's something that's recommended by our college, CVRP, and our association, is to get written consent as much as possible. Is that your experience as well, Jennifer?
Yeah. So what I would say to that is that I would say in practice in Canada, we are almost, I would say probably 90% of the time, I could be wrong, but a lot of the time we're doing verbal consent for transferable skills analysis because we're primarily doing a telephone interview. So what we would need to see, and you're right that the gold standard is written consent. So there's different ways we can approach that. We can look at providing a script to assessors, or you could have your own script where there are certain things that you will say when you're documenting consent with the client over the phone. And the second piece to that, if you use a script, is that you document that very clearly in your report, that you talked about this, 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 and this. So one of the roles that I've participated in is being on the CVRP TSA panel to review TSA examples for applicants that are looking for the TSA pathway credential. And what we've noticed there is that sometimes people will say consent obtained, and then they move on to the rest of the report. So that's not sufficient. So I guess the two pieces there are, you could have a script, which you would always go through when you talk to somebody over the phone. And that way you can also defend that you had informed consent because you can provide your script if need be. Secondly, you need to document it very carefully in your report. Thirdly, there are ways nowadays, electronic ways, that we can obtain consent very, very easily, electronic consent. We can use DocuSign, that's one of our services. You can use Adobe Sign. It's very easy and reasonable. Most people that are doing this type of work, that are reviewing large files, have purchased Adobe memberships. I have a membership so I can convert documents from PDF to Word, and I would highly recommend that, by the way, and we'll be getting into that. But then also you can use the sign function, and it's very easy. I've had people that can do it on their phone. So there are ways that we can do that, even though we're providing telephonic service nowadays.
That's right. So even though some of our clients don't have access to a computer, usually they have a smartphone. That's pretty common nowadays. So it would be possible for them just to sign on their smartphone a document. That's a good point, because I had a discussion recently about this with the college, because the same situation. I do TSAs over the phone, and you're not meeting in person, so it's hard to get a hard copy. So electronic signatures would be the way to go in that case.
Yeah, another thing that just came to mind as well is that if you're working in a claims situation, oftentimes there might be a blanket consent on file already.
Yes.
So the client has consented to vocational rehab service. And, now you could also argue the other side of that that's not enough because it doesn't say they consent to a TSA. And you would definitely have some argument there. But I think in the worst case scenario, if you have a signed consent on file, you've got one piece already in place.
Right.
And,
so it would be good practice to ask your referral source to provide a copy of that consent, so at least you have it on record.
Yes.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay.
Very,
I
very
think,
rarely I've ever had problems though around consent. Like once in a blue moon, someone will not agree,
mhm.
but most of them will, in my experience, agree to participate.
It is my experience as well. Sometimes they would be reluctant, and once you have this discussion with them to explain what is your purpose with the evaluation, and that you are being impartial, that you're not taking sides. I think often that's what they are afraid of. My experience, especially in workers' compensation, where people would show up and they're adversarial, they're expecting that you're in league with workers' comp. So you can diffuse the situation and get their consentment by explaining things firsthand.
Yeah, I think also, it's important that your client understand that as a member, most of us are members of the College of Vocational Rehab Professionals. Like we are required to be objective. Like that is part of our ethical guidelines. So if we are acting in a way that is not objective or, trying to provide an equal opinion on a file, then we're not in agreement with our ethics and we can be called for that. So, that's something we can explain. I mean, I don't know if you want to get into a big discussion about that with clients, but we do have ethical principles that we must adhere to as members of the college
That's a
and also of VRA if you're not a member of the college. But I would guess most folks doing TSAs in Canada now are members of the college or planning to be.
Yeah, that's a good point. You can reassure your client that you do have ethical standards that are enforced by your college. And if you work in a forensic venue, you also have, at least with Ontario courts, you have an obligation to be objective. So that's an additional requirement that, hey, you could mention to your client if they're really reluctant. Okay, so let me move on a little bit. We talked here about consent and what is expressed and implied consent. You've already mentioned how you can handle virtual evaluations and consent over the telephone. Since you cannot get a hard copy, there are ways around it nowadays with technology. And you've already mentioned that it's critical to document that you obtain consent and what it consists of. It's not enough to write in your report that consent was provided. You should at least outline what people consented to. Okay. So the next point that I'd like to talk about is the importance of gathering information before you do your TSA. So there is a lot of information to review, quite often medical, school, employment records. And in my practice, I've been recommended to do your review before you meet with a client or you have your phone call. And that is important for several reasons. There is, again, a lot of information to review, and it would be easy to miss important data or you miss questions that you thought you should have asked if you don't review the case in advance. So all the records will guide your interview and will avoid missing important information. And another point is that you'll be more efficient with your time. So you'll be structured, you'll cover the important points. And that's especially important with clients that have limited stamina because they have an injury or they have chronic pain. They can't be on the phone for an hour or whatever. So you want to be efficient with your time. And lastly, the point that I would discuss here is that if you do your review, your document review in advance, you get to cross-check the information that's already in the file. If you don't, then you miss that opportunity, because in my experience, I often come across factual errors in medical briefs. So other evaluators have stated this or that, and it turns out to be wrong or misunderstanding. So what is your experience of information gathering?
Yeah, so what I was gonna say is that I've seen everything from, providing, I would say, like everything but the kitchen sink for a file review. Like every possible report that's ever been written on this person is in the legal case. So the difficulty there is you have to go through and you have to find a way to not have to read or maybe go through every single document because they may not be specific to your purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So what I've found the best strategy is to get really efficient with my file reviews. I mean, it doesn't mean that I never miss anything, because I'm a human being. I certainly might miss things, but I've gotten a lot smarter about where to look for things.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, we were talking earlier. So if I'm working on a file that's a long-term disability file and I get the claim file, I know that I can look on the claims application form and there'll be there needs to be a job description provided by the employer. So I will go there and it will tell me hours of work, and usually it'll tell me wage. So I can get some pieces of the puzzle in some of these documents that I might not normally think would be ones to look for. I've also noted that there are certain things that a case manager might not even realize would be helpful for a TSA, but I know they are. So one of them I was saying before is I knew the client was involved. So this was a long-term disability case. The client was involved with WorkSafe BC, and they did voc rehab with them. And so I knew there would be a voc rehab file, and I knew that they would have to have done some sort of review. And it's very common in certain cases like auto, but more common in a long-term disability case that the person will have been involved in other programs, primarily workman's comp. So they'll be on a workman's comp claim, and then they'll switch over to long-term disability after that. So there's a whole bunch of stuff on file usually that you can get. And if you don't have it, you can always request it. So that's one thing I wanted to say. Second thing, I talked about getting everything but the kitchen sink. So that's great. At least I've got the information. I just have to find a way to efficiently review it. But the opposite of that is situations where customers have not provided me really with anything.
Mm-hmm.
I get a referral form and it says Joe Smith needs a TSA, and that's all I've got, or I might have a wage or, and I've gone back to some customers and successfully saying, you're really putting both yourself and myself in a bad ethical position by not having any information to review. Because if there is a question later on, I'm going to be asked as an assessor, why didn't I ask for the information? Why didn't I get a file? And the referral source or the insurance company is going to be asked, why didn't you provide that? And what were you going on when you identified whatever, And so if you're getting kind of very, very little information, you can, I'm not saying you're going to be always successful, and we have to balance,
But you should ask. You should
we
ask.
have to balance ethical versus business practices, and there's all those factors at play. But I think in the end, if we're in a position where we're putting ourselves at risk ethically, we should speak up and try and find that information. And then just the last piece, there are other documents that might be in a file that are going to help me for my TSA that you might not realize. And a functional abilities evaluation will have a good background information on the client. So that will give me more pieces of the puzzle that I might not have. Or a psychological assessment will have a good one, and not all of them, but a good one will have a lot of good background information that I can use to start putting those pieces together And then I will also check that with the client. So when you talked about being efficient, so when I go to the client, I already have a sketch that I think I've got, and I will check with them. Is that right? Is that right? Is
Yes.
this right? Would you, clarify this, or this doesn't make sense, or this was conflicting, so that I can be more focused in my
I work
interview.
the same way. I will do my review first and draw a portrait or profile of the client. And as I do the interview, I can just go down the information with the person. And the other thing I forgot to mention is a lot of those injuries took place years earlier. And many clients don't have clear recollection of the events. So if you just ask them, okay, what happened and when and which doctor did you see, and they may not remember half of it, especially if they have memory issues, cognitive problems. So
Right.
that is helpful in that way. So in a nutshell, you want to do your review firsthand, and if you think there are crucial information that's missing, you want to at least ask your referral source for it. And
Right.
if
And I just thought of something else too,
yeah.
Francois, is um, a, a lot of times I have found with TSAs right across the board, no matter who the customer is, a lot of times the restrictions and limitations or the functional information is not great, less than ideal. In an ideal world, we'd have an FAE for everybody, or some
Mhm.
type of OT or physio assessment, or a really good doctor's report where they checked off, can do this, can do
Yeah.
that. But we don't always get that. So that's where we have to balance, is this enough information for me to go on or not? And especially in the case of cognitive limitations. So if you have a referral source that's talking about cognitive limitations, I think you have to be very, very careful when you're doing a TSA with that kind of profile, and that you should proceed with caution, and ideally proceed with supervision, somebody who's done this for a while, to give you
Mhm.
some advice on what's the best approach with these types of cases.
Okay. Yes. So okay, that's those are good pointers. And let's move on to our next slide. So we've already discussed it quite a bit, but the kind of information that we want to gather will include employment history, education. There's also medical history. One question is, how do you get accurate work history? And how do you know if someone's past job is a true indication of their skills and abilities? So those are tricky issues to deal with. And in terms of accuracy, it's important. If someone says, well, I was a manager or I was a supervisor or whatever, that just don't take it at face value. You don't want to proceed just with the job titles. You want to review the duties and make sure that they are matching the title. And if not, you will have to assign a new title that's more accurate. So it's really important first that you get accurate job descriptions, and uh, there are multiple sources that you want to have. One is what is your client saying, and
Right.
you want also to review their resume, and if possible, as you mentioned, a job description from the employer, so you can cross-check. And if you don't have that job description, sometimes what I've done is I went to, okay, this is your last employer. So I went to check on internet to see if there are current job postings that describes your job, and that can serve as a guide. Performance
I've
review.
done that. I've done that, and yes, it's critical that you don't take a job title at face value,
Hmm.
and that you have to discuss it. I've definitely run into cases where the job title is completely opposite of what the client says they did. So, and if I would have taken that, especially, I would say, especially in manager kinds of jobs,
Yeah.
like it's oftentimes, the other thing, sometimes they give people titles that are just not what we would classify them in the NOC. Like, so I'm trying to think of an example, but a manager is one that sticks out to me, or where, they have this title and it sounds like client services care director. Okay, that's a
Very
perfect,
impressive. Yeah.
right? Client services care director, and you're thinking, whoa, that's a pretty big job. And then you talk to the person and they were, and I don't want to downplay the job, but they were on the telephone, taking orders, like for,
Yeah.
and that's not what so we really need to clarify with the client what their job duties were so that we can accurately assign a knock or a dot code. And then I would also say with that, um, oftentimes we have people that are in jobs that they're not qualified for, a lot. So as an example, I've seen this where people kind of work up the ladder. So they start as a, entry level customer service, or some sort of a, cleaner, maybe not a cleaner, but, at a lower level. And then all of a sudden they're like managing, the grocery store, and they have grade 9.
Right.
And grocery store manager should have some college. Like if we look that up in the knock, that's what we're going to see. So
Right.
how do we handle that? And I think one of the things, the important question I ask is get an accurate description of duties so that you can really be confident in the knock code you're going to use, and then also understand how long they've done that job. So if they've only done that job for 6 months, then it's probably not reasonable for us to attribute, grocery store manager, like, because the aptitudes are going to get all like, so we have to be careful there. So it's the length of time, but if that person in that example, grocery store manager, did it for 20 years with grade 8, I it was on the job training, and it's fair game. Now, would we say this guy has, as our gal has a equivalent to grade 12? No,
Mhm.
we can't do that. That would be a mistake. So, looking in other jobs, I think we have to, it can be a judgment call,
Yeah.
but I do think that we have to be careful there in assuming that when it doesn't match what the actual qualifications are. And another example I wanted to highlight as well is that when you're going over somebody's educational history, it's really, really important that you understand where they did this. So what country? Was it Canada? If it was another country outside of Canada, did they finish school? Like, would they, and most people I've talked to understand like equivalent to high school completion. Most of them will understand what you're talking about there.
Mhm.
Um, some people have been educated in the British school system. They have a whole different terminology for their education. Also, people in other countries have been educated in English. So, for instance, people in some countries, I'm just thinking in my mind, India, because I've seen it a lot. If you've gone to university in India, there's a very good chance you did that in English. So those are the types of things that we need to be mindful of, and ask those questions and not make assumptions, and
Right.
not assume just because someone has a foreign education or a not from Canada education that they don't, have equivalency. I mean, it's something that we need to be careful with as a factor.
Yeah. So as you said, education very important to look into the details. Where was that education completed? If it's a foreign education, one thing that I do sometimes, especially if it's post-secondary, is you can look at the course content and compare it. Is it generally comparable to what you would do here? And I also ask if they have post-secondary education elsewhere, did they get an equivalency in Canada? Some do, many don't, unfortunately, but some do. It's worth asking, and that gives you a little piece of evidence that you can use. Now we mentioned the NOC codes, the dot codes. Those are the typical classifications we use. Some will use the ONET in the US. I use bits and parts of the ONET to supplement what we have here in Canada. And more recently, there's the ORS, or the Occupational Requirements Survey. I don't know if you've had a look at that at all. It's
briefly, but I know it can be an amazing tool. I know it's kind of in the works. But yes, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of tools maybe that we're not familiar here in Canada that they use in the US that can be very helpful in this evaluation.
still
And
in
you mentioned
development, accumulating job statistics for the ORS, but what's interesting about it is that it provides statistics on physical and cognitive demands of jobs. Sometimes if you want to know, well, what's the percentage of cashiers that have to stand all day or can do sit-stand, you can get a statistic there. So you can make an argument that this information is relevant to whatever report you're writing.
Yeah, I think it's pretty fair that you could use descriptions from the ONET and the dot. I mean, you still have to, you can't just do it and just say, I did it. You have to explain it.
Right.
You know, why did you do it? And I've got some examples in the TSA module that I wrote about how to do that. Some job descriptions may not exist in the NOC, and they do exist in the dots, and we can go back and forth with some of those things. And I have also found that the ONET is actually a very good resource for skills and abilities, not physical abilities, but skills and abilities. They have very good job descriptions there that can be very helpful. So, you know, as long as I believe it's very reasonable that as long as you have, I mean, the ONET is a source that is supported by the US government. So it's just like our career handbook and our NOC system, which was also developed by the government. So it's a very good source. It's not a private source, so it's we would expect, and we know it's used in the United States for decision making for, you know, Social Security, which seems to be from what I've seen, like kind of the top level test of veracity. So I think we can use these things. We just need to get a little bit more comfortable in investigating and taking the time to learn the new tools.
Yeah, and I would say you want to have a good rationale. So worst case scenario is you'd have to defend your opinion and your methodology in court if you work in a forensic setting. So you'd want to understand your process and why did you use these sources and why they make sense. So for example, if you want to use US sources such as the ONET, you could say, from a Canadian perspective, you could say, well, the government has released a crosswalk between the NOC and the ONET. So which occupations are equivalent to which in the United States? And they have determined that those occupations are sufficiently similar to be, you know, to have a crosswalk. So that's the sort of evidence that you could be using. The other thing I want to say is it can be tricky to find the correct code because sometimes occupations have subtle differences. So I had a case not too long ago where I wasn't sure if the person is an accounting clerk or a bookkeeper. And when you look at the NOC, well, the differences are not that obvious. So you really have to look into the duties to find the right code. And sometimes you need more than one code to capture the range of duties. So that's what we call a composite job.
Yes, I've definitely done that before where I've used two codes to describe a person. And it's I've seen it in, like, say somebody is has got like a special skill or something, but they have their own business. And maybe they've got a retail, like that's the example that's coming to mind, where somebody, I'm trying to think of the person that they had this business and they were like a skilled trades person. So I had to use both codes. I had another example of a person who was working as a production assistant for a movie company. And the career handbook did not have a description with the aptitude. So I had to use the DOT to come up with the aptitudes. And so, but I was able to do it and it worked really well. And then just lastly, I think it's really important that if you're doing any of this kind of work, that you have adequate supervision. So that means that, in cases like this where you're not sure, you have someone who knows the work that you can talk to. Because a lot of times, in agencies and stuff, your supervisor might not really know at all about vocational. So you're the TSA person, but your supervisor is a OT. And, I'm just giving you an example, but so you would need to really cultivate professional contacts that you can run some of this stuff by, so that you can make a good call, a better call on what the NOC code should be. One example that I've run into many, many times, and it's very hard, is jobs that are in factories. So like assembly jobs, they can be really hard to code. Because they're making some kind of widget that's just not listed, and maybe you look at other assemblers and that doesn't seem to fit, and so it's definitely something that you can talk amongst yourselves, or better yet, you're gonna like me for this, Francois. Why not get on the Kavoaz forum on our website and type in a question and give us the scenario, and let some of us experienced folks give you some suggestions from our experience.
Nice plug. So yes, I was going to say that because many of us work independently, we don't have an office or coworkers, people to consult. So you want to tap in your professional network through your associations. And yes, KVOS, we have a forum, VCAP in the US, they have their forum, and I think most professional associations do have forums to facilitate sharing information like this. Okay, so I'm moving on. I'm mindful of the clock ticking.
Yeah, we gotta get going here.
The next slide. Triangulating findings. So what do we mean by that? Triangulation, it's basically having more than one source of information to confirm that your information is correct. So for example, you may compare what the person is telling you, what their behavior is telling you, if you can see them, and compare with the medical sources, the resume, the job descriptions that you have, so that you don't only rely on one data point. And again, that is one reason why you want to do your file review beforehand. And if there are any red flags, then you're going to see them ahead of time and you'll be prepared. And one more thing I wanted to say about the resumes. In my experience, it does happen that sometimes people want to boast or inflate their responsibilities so that their resume look better. And you want to be aware of that. Don't necessarily take the resume at face value. You want to cross-check, make sure that it's reliable.
Yeah, I also wanted to say here, so in forensic environments, there might be some other places you could go to cross-check details, such as LinkedIn. I've done many searches on LinkedIn where I found the individual I'm assessing, and I can see, to try and cross-check. And actually, most of them I've found to be consistent. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a good thing. That is a good
Yep.
thing. Um, and also, you mentioned before doing going on a company's website and getting a job description.
Yep.
I would also throw in there going on the job bank and coming up with a job posting and just to get an understanding of what the job should be. I have had experience, I don't know if you've done this, is assessing one of the most challenging profiles I've had, kind of two of them. One of them are the IT professionals, so the software developer, manager folks, and then also the engineers, different types. So those high level, very skilled individuals. I understand actually that the new revision of the NOC has subdivided the
Mm-hmm.
IT professionals a little bit better, which is great. I think that's good
Yeah.
because I've
Well,
had to kind of throw people into, not because I mean, we just do the best we can. Another area that's quite challenging is also like business analyst, people that are called business analysts. Like, what does that mean?
mm-hmm.
And in some cases I've seen they're like, almost a management consultant. And in other areas, once again, like some just a high level customer service person.
Yep.
So, you know, there's lots of different sources that you can access. And, one of the things I always tell the people I supervise is, and I know we're going to get to it further, but before I forget, is if you're going to recommend an occupation, you should be able to go into the job bank and find jobs, at least a couple, that your person can apply to that they're qualified for. So,
Mm-hmm.
and if you're not sure, you should do that searching on your own. Like, you need to take that time to go to the job bank and check those postings out. Maybe in other jurisdictions, they don't have to be in your client's town, but just like, are they qualified to do what you're saying they can do? Are they going to be able to get a job? Like, because sometimes I see some of these TSAs and I wonder, like, really? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, because as I think you pointed out earlier, some people have their own business, so the standards or the expectations are not necessarily the same in terms of
that's right.
qualifications, or it may be a family business, maybe some favors. So you really have to be aware of the circumstances and. Okay, yes, maybe they progress to X level, but in fact, if they were to work for another employer, they wouldn't have the needed educational background. So,
Yeah, you know what? I just thought of this one case I had. The client was like the president of the union, and it was a big job. He was earning like 100,000 a year. He was doing very, very well. He had grade 8, and he was in the hotel industry, and he literally was like a porter. Like, he started out, in the
mm,
laundry, like cleaning, and then he turned out to get up to this. But if you look up union agent in the NOC, and I also have this example in the transferable analysis module. But if you look at it up in the NOC, it says like HR professional, or it's under that. It's
right.
under that NOC code. So this guy with, grade 8 education, now we're attributing this NOC code, which by the way had aptitudes of like twos, which if you know aptitudes,
Yeah,
that's pretty high,
yeah,
twos and ones. So that's not really fair. So I had to do some more work there on trying to be a little bit more objective in
Right.
identifying.
So we will talk a little bit later about modifying the aptitude profile. All right. So I think we've covered everything we wanted about triangulation. And let's move on to the next slide. So developing the unadjusted profile. So all that information that you've gathered, file review, interview with your client, all that, you're going to summarize it in vocationally relevant information based either on the NOC or your DOT or ONET or whatever that you're using. So here we have a table that's based on a Canadian example, the NOC, but it will look familiar to Americans as well because many of the things are similar. So this is an example profile of someone's who had the different jobs where we put the NUC code, how much time they spent, and for each of those occupations, you have the different traits that are there in terms of aptitudes, interests, physical capacity, or physical demand of the job, and your DPT, so data, people, and thing factors. So what that tells you, and at the bottom here, you'd have your unadjusted profile, which is a composite of all those traits. And that tells you how the person was able to function before their disability. That's the assumption that we're making, and also we are taking the highest trait and assuming that if they demonstrated that level before, they potentially could do so again. So one thing to remember about aptitudes here is that they are tied to the occupation and not to the person. So in some case, for example, a person's aptitude could be higher than what was required of their job. So it would be wrong, for example, to say that, oh, because this person, if we look at clerical perception, for example, it'd be wrong to say, well, this person has a low average clerical perception. No, actually, that's what was required of the jobs that he performed. In fact, it could be higher. And it's often the case with people who are underemployed. It can happen often with immigrants who were highly educated, ended up being a truck driver or maybe a motorcycle mechanic, I don't know. So that's something really important to remember. You cannot assume that the person is functioning at a low average level, let's say, just based on their work history. So the way I look at it is the composite profile is a representation of the minimum level demonstrated.
Well, and it's really all we have. So it's not the best, but it is as good as we have for some cases. Now, there'll be other cases where we're going to say, you know what, we really, because the best information is doing testing, right? So, like this, we're doing some predictions based on the person's work experience, but the best information we can get or most objective would be their actual testing results. If we actually tested everybody's aptitudes, and then we could compare that with this composite profile, and then do some more triangulation and analysis and decide whether that makes sense or not. But we don't always have that opportunity, and probably most cases with TSAs we don't. So it's the best information we have. We just have to understand that, this at best is a prediction. It's not, or, it's an estimation.
Right.
It's certainly not carved in stone, like you say. And people's abilities could be higher or lower. in the example of people doing jobs that they're not qualified for, or, you know, and you know, this is getting a bit off topic, but I've tested many people that come nowhere near what their composite profile would show.
Mhm.
Like their demonstrated skills are nowhere near their composite profile. So that tells us something.
And were those people injured in some way, or?
Yes,
Mhm.
yes.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, you know, anyway, that's just a fact. So, you
Yes.
know, there you are, and just know what it is and know that it has limitations.
So one thing that I wanted to touch is, how do you determine if someone has enough experience or training to get the qualification profile here? So sorry. So the study guide, and when I say study guide, I'm talking about the CCV, ICV study guide, will tell you.
Excellent resource, by the way. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Even if you don't take the test, I think it's worth having that. Honestly,
I
I think it's
consider
worth
it,
the purchase for
yeah,
anybody to have that in their library who's doing vocational work. It's an excellent resource.
I consider it a desk reference for
Yeah,
practitioners as well. It's not just to take your certification.
yeah.
Yeah, so I was going to say that the study guide recommends a minimum of 6 months. And what they're talking about here is SVP, or specific vocational preparation. And that is a concept that you will find in the DOT and the ONET. ONET talks about job zones now, but it's derived from the DOT. Canada no longer has SVP in their classification, as it did way back in the CCDO.
Mhm.
But you at least have a crosswalk to the ONET, so you can use that to compare with American sources. So another thing so instead of saying, okay, is it 6 months or less, I will instead look at the SVP, and that will tell me more precisely what is the required amount of training and experience for a particular occupation. The other thing is, it's important to remember that SVP factors in not only training on the job, but also education. So it's especially important with skilled jobs where you have college education. And so someone may have a diploma in accounting, 2 or 3 years, and they only have 6 months of work experience, but you have to count both. You can't just say,
Right.
I'm dismissing it because he's only worked for 6 months. So
Yeah.
that's where you'll have the education has to be factored in your
Yes,
calculation.
for sure.
Yeah,
And then you have people that have education that they've never used.
that's
You
right.
know, like they were trained as a nurse and never nursed.
Mhm.
Or, you know, they trained as a teacher, never taught. And, you know, how do we handle that?
It's a good segue into what they call in Social Security as past relevant work. So how far back should you go into the work history? 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, all the way. Um, I think there are different practices out there, different rationales. To me, the bottom line is you should have your rationale. I've reviewed TSA reports where it seemed arbitrarily they had picked X amount of time, let's say 10 years, but there's no explanation why they cut out
Yes,
10 years. So you should have a rationale in there.
yes,
If you want to use Social Security and they use 15 years, you could do that as a justification. But you want to remember that Social Security, they talk about skills and how skills become obsolete. They don't talk about aptitudes, and aptitudes are stable over a long period of time.
hmm
So for me personally, I will go all the way back in the work history to capture the aptitudes. But then later I will see if the skills are still relevant or not. So I won't artificially dismiss someone perhaps 15 years ago had an engineering job or education, and you wouldn't want to cut it off because it's outside of your range.
I know, I think you have to consider that. And then also, like, I've had people say, oh, well, it was more than 15 years ago, so I didn't include it on the report. I'm like, okay, but they did this job for, it was the same job with another employer for 10 years or whatever. You should include that on the TSA because it establishes they have a longer work history. So, like just in a simple example, they worked 15 years as a nurse for hospital A, and then he worked 10 years for hospital B. Well, they've got 25 years of work history in that field, and we would never disregard those 10 years. So you have to use common sense with that,
right?
That guideline. Like you have to, consider some other things. But I think in the end, the most important thing, and we keep coming back to this over and over and over, is that we have to document why.
Yeah.
So it's not enough that the reader will understand that we mean, oh yeah, it's 15 years. That's why it's not there. No. And as a supervisor, I always go through the reports with the question of somebody that knows nothing. Like that's how I approach the report. So, if I go through and that hasn't been explained, even though I understand, I want that in the report because that report, and this is a good time to say, like your report could be read by so many different people in the grand scheme of things. The client, the claims adjuster, supervisor, numerous lawyers, other supervisors or coaches within the insurance company, managers, like so many people could have access to your report. And that's really a reflection of your professionalism. So just keep that in mind when you're putting something out there, how many eyes could actually be on it. It's really something you should be taking seriously.
Yeah, there's that. And also, if you have to, again, explain it in court, what was your method? You'll be thankful to have explained it in
100%. And I had that like yesterday. And I got called. I did the report, who knows how long ago, year ago, whatever. I remember the client, but that's about it. But I know if I have to go to court now, I explain very clearly how I came up with my recommendations.
Right.
And so that's what I'm going to go on. And it's not, especially with wages and things. So it's really, really important. Documentation is so important.
Right. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide, which is what we call adjusted profile. So how do we modify the profile considering the person's what we call residual functional capacity? So we talked earlier about physical or cognitive impairments. How do we take that into account? What sources should we be using? So let's talk a little bit about that. So first of all, you want to account for medical impairments. That's one of your major source of information to see how is this person functioning now. And unfortunately, I find in my experience, having reviewed a lot of reports, that it's often disregarded. So you want to account for the person's impairments, but I see that many evaluators will instead defer to medical assessors. They'll say, okay, here's a job XYZ this person can do based on skills and aptitudes, and I defer to the doctor to say if that job is suitable. Well, you're abdicating now one of your core function as a VE, and it's part of our scope of practice to take the medical information and translate that into vocational impairments. And really, the doctors, and I don't know if you were at the same conference, but years ago we had a KWAR conference, a medical doctor talking about that, and he said the same thing. He says, we keep being asked by insurers to comment on employability, and we're not the right people.
Right.
Right?
But absolutely, like doctors are not, knowledgeable of these things. And, we complain on the other side of things. Look, this doctor says so-and-so can't do anything. What are they basing it on? So how can we then go turn around and go back? We defer to the doctor. Like, it's just, I totally,
That's it. I mean, their role is to comment on injuries and impairments and not on employability.
right. And I think in the case, though, that we have the information that's adequate for functional, and a lot of times we don't. So there's kind of a bit of a pinch that we are in to make those recommendations. And often the customer will tell us what they think it should be, and that's good. At least you've got something. And, but to defer back to the doctor. One thing I will say, though, a comment that I will make is that this job, you're going to have to be careful about job postings and specific jobs, because some might not be suitable. And I'll give the example, because it's a simple one, of a manager of the trade. So like a plumber manager or an electrician supervisor. So in the NOC, that occupation is classified, I believe it's limited. It could be light, but I'm pretty sure it's limited.
Light or limited.
That's a sedentary, right? So, but there are many supervisors in the field that have to do the work of the people that they're supervising. So that specific job would not be suitable in that employer. But there may be other employers that they are. So I'll often make a comment, careful attention to job search will be required, as some positions may not be suitable. Because, we have the NOC, and then we have the world of work, what's really going on out there. And, I know the NOC people are doing their very, very best to try and have the NOC reflect what the real world is like. But we know in the field, as in our experience as vocational counselors, that does not always happen. And so, once again, these are the limitations of the tools that we work with.
Right. And that's why it's important to recognize that, yes, the NOC or the DOT are primary sources, but that's not all the information that you should look at. So
No.
for one thing, those classifications don't get updated too frequently. So it may be on a 5-year or even 10-year cycle. And it doesn't capture how the world of work is evolving. So you want to pay attention to that. And
oh, sorry, I was just going to say, and that's that. I've already mentioned it, but that's where you can go into the job search websites and find postings and be able to support your recommendations and save them, attach them as enclosures with your TSA report, even if you don't have to. Like, I will ask my evaluators, like, we don't, some TSA assessors do always assign postings in their TSAs. We don't, but I say, like, for certain specific situations, to attach postings, because that will always support you for your recommendations. Like if there's something for not only for physical demands, but for educational requirements and for wages.
Right. And there's something else you mentioned earlier, that within an occupation, you have a range of jobs, right? And that's how occupations are classified. They're families of jobs. So some positions may be suitable, others not, even though they're in the same occupation. So that's why it's important to go to the labor market and have a look at by the devil's in the details. So
Yeah, you know, the one that comes up all the time is light delivery driver is another one, you know. In the knock, it's coded as medium.
yeah,
And so, you know, if you're going to use light, here's a word of caution. If you're going to use light delivery driver in your TSA, please support, and your client can only do light work,
mhm,
please support it with some postings. Because
right.
I think,
You're gonna get hit if you don't.
well, you could get caught there because the knock says medium. So, you know, I really don't think it's good enough to say, there's other jobs. And you know why? Because I've done the labor market surveys to try and find jobs. And this, my case was for truck drivers, like AZ truck drivers.
Yeah.
So a customer wanted me to find no, I think they call it, a term would be called pin to pin,
Mhm.
meaning like they don't do any physical labor. I made, I think it was, I didn't do a ton of calls, but I made like 4 calls
Yeah.
about physical demands of truck drivers, and not one person would agree that there are jobs that there's no lifting required. Not one.
Yeah.
They said even if there's no lifting, there's awkward positioning. You know, climbing all around the truck, going underneath the truck, like all that stuff. So,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
I think we need to be.
I had a case a little bit different, but he used to work as a garage manager. And the question, well, now he had a back injury and he had trouble standing. So if you look at the knock, he'll tell you it's probably sedentary work, mostly.
Yeah.
And the facts are, when you look at actual jobs, it's not. You still have to do some of the manual work and walk around and
Yep.
bend. Same thing for a job like a crane operator, which I know is listed as limited strength or sedentary. But in fact,
Yeah.
when you look in the field, crane operators have to do a lot of preparatory work, not just manipulating controls. So,
Right. And they have to climb in and out of their
right. So
vehicle sometimes, like, you
you would
know,
know that from just reading the knock. So you got to
right.
be aware that it's not the only source.
Yeah, you know what I do if I ever get a chance, I don't know if you've done this, is if anyone ever will allow me to go and see their workplace, I always take them up on that. I was able to get a friend to take me through. I don't know how he did it, but he got permission for us to come and see the production floor
Okay.
in a factory, and it was that has served me so well.
You did a
Those
field
tours,
audit.
you I did a tour of the casino, Niagara Casino, all the different jobs there. So, you know, anytime you have a chance, and when you're, you know, anytime, look around. What are people doing? How are they lifting? Are they not? You know, like just make
Yeah,
yourself a student of work.
that brings to mind that, well, it's great if you have the opportunity to visit a work site, but if you don't, I would say look at career videos. There are lots of those out there, and they'll show you the worker on site, and you sometimes words cannot give you an accurate description, or it's incomplete.
Yep.
But when you see the person in action, you can say, oh yeah, they have to bend, they have to lift things, and that may not be captured in the classification.
Yeah, now is that I might be wrong, but is the source the Alberta Learning Information System? They have a lot of videos. That's a great
Mm.
site. ALIS. I don't know
Yes.
what but they have a lot of great videos of people at work, and I'm sure there's many more on the internet. I mean,
Yeah, that's
YouTube.
right. There are many of them. If you just type career videos, you can just Google it. Even YouTube has many of them.
Yep, great
I
suggestion.
wanted to say a few words again about medical evidence because this happens more with vocational evaluations than with TSAs, but quite often I'm confronted with conflicting medical evidence. So you may, if you're in a forensic setting, you may work for defense or plaintiff, and then you'll have Dr. A who's the plaintiff doctor who says one thing, and on the other side they say another thing. So how do you handle conflicting medical information for your report? What's your experience like?
Oh, you ask me. Yeah, so that can be really hard to express. And I know I addressed it in the TSA module. We actually went through a little example. So
Mm-hmm.
if you take that module, you can see I've addressed that whole issue of conflicting medical.
Your
And
upcoming module you're talking about?
yeah, the advanced TSA module, I did put an example in there of that. Um, and how do I handle that? Sometimes what I'll do, I know how you handle it,
Mm-hmm.
Francois, but what I will do is oftentimes I will look at kind of the least, if I put it together, it's more so in an illegal situation or
Right.
forensic situation. So this isn't just a regular, long-term disability TSA, because I'll usually get that clarified before
Mm-hmm.
I
In
do it. But
advance.
if it's a legal one, so there's not going to be any clarity coming. I've got to go with what I've got, and I'll usually go with, like, if it's a compilation,
Mm-hmm.
I'll take the lowest one. So I'll give everything the benefit of the doubt and be very conservative, in my opinion. That's what I would
Right.
go.
And you want,
Although, you know what? I can't say I've seen a ton of that. Maybe because I haven't had as much experience as you, like where someone will say it's black and then the other one says it's white. I haven't seen that much variability in my experience, but
yeah, it's
defer
my
to.
bread and butter. I see it all the time because I mostly do forensic work, and the way I handle it and what I've discussed with some colleagues is that it, one good approach, and that preserves your objectivity in the eyes of the court, is to create scenarios. So if Dr. A is correct, here is your vocational opinion. If Dr. B is correct, here's your vocational opinion. And that way you sidestep taking sides, and you preserve your objectivity. And that, I think, that can save you a lot of complications if you have to testify. But that's
Absolutely.
really particular to the forensic field. As you
That's
said,
right.
generally, if you do disability claims or other areas of work, uh, hopefully the medical limitations will be clear.
Well, and if it's not, you'll clarify that before you write up your report. You'll get a written confirmation of the clarity before you write your report up.
Right. The other thing that I want to bring up in terms of limitations is sometimes the client,
Can
and
you
one,
hold on? Can you pause for a second? I have a thing going off. Just hold on. Just one
yes,
second.
just a moment. Okay, so I want to add one more thing about medical restrictions. Is sometimes you will interview the evaluee or the client, and they'll bring up some limitations that are not on record. So how do you handle that? So I think you should review those thoroughly and document them in your report, and if possible, get evidence that's on record. Sometimes it was not provided in the first place, but it's there. And if not, it may be part of your recommendations that these reported limitations should be investigated, as they can affect someone's outcome.
Yes, I agree with you there. And what we'll do a lot of times, I mean, that when you talk about common, that's way more common is the client says one thing, the doctor says something else. That happens all the time. The insurer says one thing, the client says something else. So what we'll do is in cases where it's really outside of what is documented, like the insurer says they can do medium level work and the client says I can't, lift a pound. Like let's just say that's the example. So we will document that in the restrictions and limitations, the date of our discussion, as much information that the client provided as possible, reference to anything else we found to support it or not support it. I'll give you an example where a client says, I can only sit for 5 minutes. So I would write that in my report. As a client says he can only sit for 5 minutes. However, review of initial assessment report documented that the client sat for 2 hours for the interview. So, and that's another detective work piece. So, if you have those kinds of things, or, you know, you see something that says the person can only sit for 2 minutes or something, like that's not very long. And it would be very, very difficult to live if you could only sit for 2 minutes.
Right.
Even 5 minutes, you know, and I've seen it a lot. So, you know, is there any other information in the file to document their ability to sit or stand? Or, you know, maybe there isn't, but, you know, you can also reference, if you have an initial interview, what the person talked about for function. And, you know, if that sounds like, sometimes when you read what people report for function, it sounds a bit outrageous. Like, it doesn't sound like how is this? I mean, you have to have a little bit of a critical eye. Like, how
Yeah.
does this, like, function? You know, you could lay down for 1 minute, stand for 1 minute, and sit for 1 minute. What are you doing? How are you living? You know, like, to me, I would be very critical of that. I would immediately want to go look in the file for other information to see what else there was in there. But back to the point, I would document it, and then I will make a comment that if you know, this is what the insurer provided, this is what the client says, probably make recommendations based on the insurer, but I will make a point there that if anything changes or there's new information, I'm happy to look at this again. And I've definitely had cases come back where there's updated medical and the insurer told me one thing and now it's the person has much less functionality. And so, you know, and that's, to me, that's fine, because then I can just review it and make a recommendation. I just did it last week for a file. And it definitely changed my recommendations, the new medical.
Yeah, this goes more into report writing, but I will put in there that I reserve the right to change my opinion should there be new information available.
Yeah.
So
I mean, that can go. I think that can go in any report. It doesn't have to be forensic.
The college often talks about protecting the client, and that's great. But you also have to protect yourself as a professional. And if you want to have a long career, you have to follow a sound methodology and document your process. So let's talk a little bit here about the components of what we consider. So physical impairments, we've talked about that, and we look at the medical data, and hopefully it's consistent. And based on that, well, I've highlighted this in the profile. So if we go back one slide, we saw that this person had a medium capacity, but now we've changed it to light because this person has an injury. And you could even make the case that if the person has a hand injury, it may affect also their finger dexterity. So you would look at physical impairments, but also psychological impairments are important. Psychological, emotional, depression, anxiety issues. You'd want to have a good source for it because it's outside of our scope of practice. So if you have a psychologist report that will identify barriers, you want to consider that. And you can refer to the NOC, for example. If someone has anxiety disorder and has difficulty dealing with stressful situation in the public, then you wouldn't want to put them a job where they'd have to do this type of work, customer service, telemarketing, whatever that would create contact with maybe confrontational customers and such.
Yeah, I just had a case today actually where we went over. So the customer gave us as a restriction less cognitively demanding work. That's what they said. And I said, that's not clear enough for us.
Not clear enough. Yeah, cognitive impairment. So how we define that?
But what it came out, and this was also a case where we didn't have a lot of background information, so it was very difficult for us. But so, but it came about that this person was a child welfare worker.
Okay.
So they were out on the road all the time in child welfare situations, super, super stressful job, and ended up not being able to stay on the job and been off multiple times actually over this. And so I suggested, well, why don't, you need to go back and look at the medical a little bit further, like what the psychologist is saying, because there was some reference to triggers and this and that. So, like, let's get down to what that is and try and come up with something that might be more reasonable in this person's case, because this person has cognitive ability. It's just that they were in a position. I mean, this was my assumption, and I could be wrong. You can always argue on the other side of all of this, by the way. But my assumption is that child welfare work is very challenging emotionally, and this person just didn't, wasn't able to manage that, and for whatever reason, maybe let's look outside of that. But I wanted to ask, like, does this person still want to work in the helping profession? Because they had like a social work degree, and I don't know if they had a master's, but they had a lot of good education. Like it wasn't. So I mean, we also have to look at like their level in life too. Like you can't say like garbage collector to like the highest VP of operations. You know what I mean? Like it's got to be something in most cases. If they're making a claims decision, it's got to be something that's kind of within their scope of life, like not completely. So I suggested that they get more clarity on what exactly is going on here, and that for as a blunt tool, a TSA is really not the kind of assessment you can do with people who have cognitive limitations, like just cognitive limitations.
Right. You need more details. Yeah, you need more details. And now, if you have more specific information about cognitive limitations, then you want to know, what do you compare those limitations to, right? With the tool that we have. So
it's very difficult. And I wouldn't really recommend going down that road very often if you can help it. I really wouldn't. If you have people that have cognitive limitations, you're best to have a neuropsych assessment or some kind of a high level cognitive abilities evaluation or something, rather than just going on what people are saying about either their own reports or the psychologist's basically reiteration of their own reports, but I would say on the note of psychological impairments, that there are certain things that maybe aren't so good for folks that have these kinds of challenges. Like, for instance, rotating shift work is something that's very difficult for people that have trouble like with sleep and anxiety and all these things. Rotating shift work often just doesn't work for that. So, so no rotating shift work is a reasonable limitation or restriction. Non-client facing or non-customer facing is another area. I mean, I've had referrals come through and they say no work with people, like no something about like no interaction with others.
Yeah.
So,
that's too much of a blanket statement.
Yeah. Every job requires interaction with others. So we have to go back and clarify a little bit more, because I can't recommend a job that it does not and sometimes it's like the problem here really is the work environment. It's not the job, it's the work environment. So they could do their own job in another environment, like the
Right.
swing shift is a good example. If they had a job that was straight day shifts, they could do it, but they can't, and so there are other, once again,
Yeah, there
more
are
factors.
nuances to consider. As you said, sometimes the issue is not the work itself, but it's the environment in which they were that were creating conflicts or stress or whatever. So one thing I wanted to say about cognitive impairments is there is information in the NOC or the DOT that you can compare to get a sense of what are the cognitive demands of jobs. So, for example, the aptitudes, we have the GVN, which refers to the cognitive demands of jobs. The DOT will have the same thing. And also you have in Canada what we call essential skills profiles, which will give you information on mental demands. You can use that information to support your opinion. That is quite useful, and these essential skills profile now will be replaced in Canada by the new skills and competencies taxonomy, which will be part of the new NOC. But that will be a discussion for another time.
I do want to put in there, like, so I think that those tools are very good and useful tools, but you have to have the function of the client first.
Yes,
That's the first piece, right?
that's
So if it just says, no work with people, the NOC is not going to help you.
right.
You
Yeah,
need
yes.
more clarity.
You need to something to work with, first of all. Yeah.
Right. And that would come from a more objective evaluation of their ability. So not what the client says, so that's self-report, not that,
Right.
but like a neuropsychological assessment, a cognitive abilities assessment, or some other psychological assessment where some tools were used.
The thing is, in disability claims, impairments are usually only compensated if there's medical evidence of impairment. It's not because you said so.
Well, you'd be surprised. I'm just telling you from my experience.
But that's how it should be. There has to be evidence of impairment, and that's why you want to go back to, okay, maybe do functional abilities or an orthopedic assessment or a psych assessment to identify objectively what are the impairments instead of relying only on subjective information.
Absolutely.
Okay. So I'm moving on to the next slide.
I think we gotta speed along here, Francois.
We have to speed along a little bit, eh? Yes.
Yes, I think so.
But we will have to cut wherever we have to cut and have another session in the future. But let's move on. So determining a match. So the next step now is if you've identified that the profile, you've taken into account the impairments, what's the next step? So you want to understand, okay, is a person able to go back to their previous job or maybe with a different employer or a different occupation, right? That is the scope of the TSA based on their skills. And one thing I want to say here is the purpose of the TSA, it's important to understand that depending on the venue you're working in, it can be vocational rehabilitation where you're assisting someone to reintegrate the workforce. They may have access to certain services, maybe a bit of retraining. But sometimes if you work in a forensic setting, for example, it's not really about vocational rehabilitation. It's about determination of your entitlement for benefits, and that's it. And to understand in which venue you're working is really important, because if you're not careful and you say, well, this person could do this job provided they have this and that service, and the educator ends up cutting their benefits because you said they could go hypothetically back to work.
Yeah, I've seen that. I've seen that before. And one of the things that we make sure we're crystal clear on is that we really don't make many recommendations in TSAs for like much. And that's the limitation of a TSA, actually. I think if we're making a lot of recommendations in the TSA, we might be coming a little bit out of our scope for that service, and that we should be doing another level of assessment. You know, like, because TSA essentially is just a paper review and a talk with the client, or maybe an interview with the client. You don't have an awful lot. I mean, you have your file information, but you know, at best, it's the initial level of assessment is all it
There's
really
no
is.
testing involved.
Right. It's the first, you know, so you really have to be careful. And one of the things I always tell my people is that we don't make recommendations in TSA. So if the job we're recommending requires a whole bunch of stuff, then it's probably not reasonable. Many of our assessments are utilized for claims decisions. So, you know, if they can't do it, then we shouldn't be recommending it. If there's too much that they're going to need to do it, like one good thing would be a level of accommodation, right? Like, how much accommodation is this person going to need? And I always, when I talk with my customers, I'll say, like, is it really fair that so and so has to change positions all this amount? Like, is an employer really going to accommodate this, or they need excuse me, voice activated software and all those things? Are they really going to be able to take that to another employer? Like, you know, is that really fair? And I think in a lot of cases, it's really, you know, you could say that, you know, employers have to accommodate people with disabilities. That is true. There's laws. They do have to do that. But do they? Let's go back to the world of work. Is that a realistic thing? And, you know, by me saying so and so can do it if they have this, this, and this, I'm essentially signing or whatever, helping to assist with cutting their benefits off. And
Based
that's
on your knowledge of the world of work. So is it a reasonable?
and that's my expertise, right? My expertise is in the world of work. And if I don't know the world of work, then I need to take the responsibility of learning that. I have to go out there, and just like we made all those suggestions of how you could do that.
It's good that you brought up the issue of accommodation, because it's something we have to deal with in many venues. So you want to know the parameters of the venue you're working in. For
Yes.
example, if and for American colleagues, if you work with Social Security, you don't take into account accommodations. By definition, for them, it's work as commonly performed. So
Right.
you don't take accommodation into account. But in other venues, perhaps the workers' compensation or
Yep.
other disability services.
Veterans, if you're working with veterans that are in a voc rehab program, they would have access to all, possibly all kinds of services and accommodations.
Right.
But having said that, and we addressed this in the advanced TSA module, this whole issue of scope of practice. So we have to be very careful we're not stepping outside the boundaries of that.
Mhm.
And one thing that I have my people do is say accommodation may be required, defer to the appropriate professional for that, because it's not my expertise what accommodation this person needs, i.e. sit, stand, stool, I don't know, standing workstation, voice activated software, all those things
Right.
is really not my
Yeah.
expertise.
The way I present it is I may speak in general terms. I may say accommodations to consider could be X, Y, Z, but this should be verified.
Yes, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So at least you're saying that you're knowledgeable of commonly used accommodations at work. It could be, as you said, assistive technology or a sit-stand desk, or, you know, a modified keyboard. but really in practice, is it suitable? That has to be determined by someone who performs that type of assessments. Okay, so we're moving on to our next slide, and we're going to talk about potential alternatives. So if they cannot go back to their previous work, so what should we be looking at? So direct entry is the purpose of the TSA, right? It's usually is you don't want to recommend jobs that have a need for retraining.
Well, we can do short-term retraining with the TSA. So less than 6 months, specific focus skills training like computer skills, first aid, some kind of a very simple type of a quick program, customer service skills, sales skills, all those kinds of things you could reasonably recommend in a TSA, but anything beyond that, no. You wouldn't recommend a college certificate or some sort of anything that would be lengthier than 6 months or more involved than some of the other ones I just mentioned.
Right. I would say you want to be aware again of the venue in which you're working. What are the parameters? And as you said, in some venues, they will consider a retraining, let's say up to 6 months.
Yes.
I would say in a forensic setting, and I'm speaking for Ontario now on the auto insurance industry, there have been several court decisions that have said that some training is acceptable as long as it's not extensive. Yes. Now, they don't define what they mean by that, but I recall reading about a truck driving license, for example, which was suitable because it took only, let's say, a few weeks.
Yes.
So I think it's consistent with what you're saying.
Yes.
Workers' compensation, I mean, depending on the venue, they will allow a certain amount of retraining.
But they usually do testing. Workers' compensation, if the person is involved in workers' compensation, they're usually done some sort of testing with them, vocational assessment or psychovocational or psychoeducational, usually. So if they're going to recommend training, they've normally done that.
And for all viewers here, I'm skipping over some of the notes. You'll have access to the slides with all the notes in there and links for further information. We could be at it for 10 hours if we went through.
Yes, that's right. So, we love TSAs.
Yes. So I will move on to our next slide here. We're going to talk about some tools of the trades. We talked about classifications earlier, but practically, how do we handle all that information? One way to do that is to use a software, what we commonly refer to as a TSA software. There are a few out there, and in Canada, I'm only aware of one, which is a Quick Knock.
There's another one that they're using called Bridges.
Bridges, that's right. That's, I think, in Quebec.
I don't know, because I think Bridges is similar to Choices, or the incarnate of Choices. So Choices, and now it's called Bridges or something like that. But regardless, that tool was developed for school-aged children. It was for schools. That's that tool, not Quick Knock, but that tool was. And the one case I was talking about, the insurer is using it to make claims decisions. So I find that to be quite disconcerting because, for a lot of reasons. But let's have this discussion and see where it goes. You can tell where I land on the TSA software. It has its uses, but I think, anyway, go ahead.
So let's give a little overview of what are the strengths and limitations of TSA software. So Well, first of all, as I said, in Canada, there's the quick knock or maybe bridges or choice. In the US, there's SkillTran. I think that's a very commonly used software. There's a MVQS. That's another one. You can review that in the notes. And for those who have access to Volpar system, that's another software that can be used, but that's all US based. Now, strengths, one benefit is it can save you time because it's a massive amount of information to sift through, many parameters to consider when you want to decide, is this occupation suitable or not? So it can save you time, and it can assist you in being more accurate and consistent in your method. And the other thing is it's comprehensive. It considers a lot of factors within the classification. So all the aptitudes, the physical demands, and depending on the software you're using, it may consider the wages, some labor market information. So I think those are the main benefits of using a software. So it will give you consistency. It gives you a large amount of information quickly and accurately. But there are limitations as well. The software sometimes is not updated as often as it should be. So that's something to keep in mind. Just like the classification itself may not be up to date. And sometimes the software can artificially include or eliminate occupations. So, for example, we talked earlier about accommodations. Well, the software is not going to take that into account. Or if a bit of retraining is required, it won't take that into account either.
No.
So that has to be done by the practitioner. And another limitation of the software is you have to understand what it's based on. So it may be based only on the NOC or the DOT, and it does not take into account other sources, as we discussed earlier, the labor market information that you would tap into to cross-check or confirm what's in the NOC. So
Yeah. Go ahead.
There's that, and just to follow up on that, I would say that some users just misunderstand how the software was designed, and it can lead to user errors.
Yeah, so I'll tell you now. I'll tell you a little bit of my experience with all of this. And so, you referenced that it doesn't know much about work, or I call it the world of work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the TSA software does not understand the world of work. And classic example is truck driver. So if you do a search on the quick knock for truck driver and you say sedentary high school, let's say, you will not get the job of dispatcher, which is the most transferable, relatable occupation. In Canada, we have another job called route scheduler. It's another not code, another kind of grouping of jobs that are totally relating to that. You won't see those things. You won't see, if you type in mechanic, you won't see service advisor. And service advisor is a related occupation to mechanic, but it won't. So you need to know that. And so those are the types of limitations that you will get with software. So it's not intuitive. It doesn't know these nuances that a vocational counselor does who has experience. It misses stuff. I've also had some examples, and this is lately. So I remember when I first started out in the field, so this is 25 years ago, we used choices. I worked for a school board and we were helping high school students. And we would get these job lists. And I remember we always joked about this job. It was called lock and cable ferry operator, lock operator, something like that. That's the job. I think it's called lock and cable ferry operator.
Okay.
So that was back in high school, 25 years ago. Okay. Fast forward, I'm going to say it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, a customer who was using Choices as a tool to help make claims decisions sent us a referral. And on the file, I read that they had designated that job to this client. Well, lock and cable ferry operator is very specific to certain communities.
Right.
There's where are the locks? I mean, in Ontario, they're in Peterborough, they're in, certain cities, but they're certainly not here in Toronto. Okay, maybe Welland. Okay, I'll give you Welland.
Right.
But like downtown Toronto, the client's not going to drive to Welland to go work on and it's not even a lock and cable ferry operator. It's a lock. Like
Yeah,
it's
like a subway train operator, right? It's the same thing.
right, like exactly.
Yeah.
So that job title, and I use it specifically because it comes up and I've seen it on files. So it's a real world example of a completely, in my experience, irrational recommendation. There may be the odd circumstance where that one might be reasonable, but very few. I would also argue that that's not a sedentary job. I don't think it is.
Right.
Like, I mean, you're working on a ferry, you're hauling things, you're parking car. Like, who knows? Like, I don't think it's sedentary, but in Choices, that's what it's listed. And it's legacy, 25 years, it's still doing that. So that's one of the limitations. I also wanted to say that there is a function now with all these changes with the knock. I'm not sure if it's going to be left, but there's a function called advanced search that you can go into the career handbook and you can do a little bit more searching. It's not as good as quick knock, or you don't get as many factors, but you can do a lot of factor searching on the career handbook, and you don't have to have the software. You just need to do some practicing to see to get some lists, and then you can use that to document your recommendations. What I would do, we do have that software. We have Quick Knock. We have access to it, and I will use it in certain circumstances for cases like those tough ones, those computer ones, the engineers, the ones that are really high paying, like see if it will give me some, get the juices flowing in terms of what occupation. So I would still do, I call that a manual review. I will still do a manual review of the knock, meaning it's just me doing the review. I'm basing it on my experience. I feel I can defend it based on many years. I will supplement with software if need be, but it doesn't happen very often.
I see. Okay. Yeah, but certainly it's good to be aware of the
Yes.
limitations of the software, and that it does get dated. You have to be aware how often it gets updated.
Yeah, I think Quick Knock doesn't have the 2021 version
Mm-hmm.
of the knock. It's using the oldest version. It's 2011, I think, or 2016.
2011.
2011.
Well, yeah, the previous version would be 2016. So
Yeah.
it is important then to be aware of specific labor market conditions. You mentioned the lock operator, or it could be the subway train, or even parking lot attendant, which is to me a royal pain in the butt, because
Yes.
one of those jobs that keep popping up because
It does.
the demands, the requirements are so low. But in fact, in several communities, either there are very limited opportunities, or there are still demands that are not properly listed in the knock. So
yeah, like so. I mean, that comes back to knowing your menu too.
yeah.
So for workman's compensation, you have to be able to establish there's demand for the work. So it's not going to work. It won't. It won't. I can't imagine a case where it would fly, unless maybe downtown Toronto, possibly, but or other city centers. But what was I going to say here? I lost my train of thought. So,
Well, considering the labor market, you want to be aware of that before you recommend a job.
yeah, I totally lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. Keep going.
That's okay. If it comes back, we can come
I'm
back.
sure it will.
So let's see. Our next slide. Okay, so we were talking about parking lot attendance as an example and you had something to add to that.
Yeah, so sorry I lost my train of thought on that.
No problem.
But my point was know your venue. So my example was with WSIB or Workman's Comp, WorkSafe, wherever you are. You normally have to prove that there's demand for the job. So you have to find postings, you have to support the labor market. In other venues like long-term disability and maybe some other, mostly probably long-term disability, the job just has to exist. So in places like downtown Toronto, there are jobs for parking lot attendants. However, you would not use parking lot attendant for someone who lives in Northern Ontario or Northern British Columbia where there are no parking lots. That's not reasonable. So you need to know your venue. And I'm sure in other venues like veterans or Social Security, all that, you probably have to provide some sort of level of demand for the job by postings or something
Yeah.
like that.
So that's the nuance you're making, that depending
Yes.
on the venue, it's not only enough to show that jobs exist, but you have to demonstrate that there are opportunities available
In some
in some venues.
venues, yes.
Right. In some venues.
Probably most. I would guess in most venues.
Right. And I would add, so knowing about the venue is that in the US with Social Security, is as long as the job exists at the national level, it's good enough.
Oh, okay.
See, that's an
That's
important
different.
point. And a
Well,
lot
you
of
know what? I will tell you, I had a customer, a very, very, very large insurer, and they had a policy on this, and they said this is long-term disability. They said it had to exist in Canada. That was their, in writing.
that's very
So
strict. Yeah, that's very strict because normally you would
just
think, okay, local labor market, and rule of thumb, I typically use 50 kilometers when I look at employment opportunities, but it depends on the venue. As you said,
yeah,
in some cases it's a much wider range.
absolutely.
Hmm. I see. Well, that would be a great point to stop here. We've covered today a lot of topics, that the do's and don'ts of TSAs, what type of data to consider, the importance to review your data ahead of time, to triangulate your information as much as possible, not to rely only on one source of data, and to consider your medical information to support your opinion. And what else? Let me just go back briefly.
The composite profile we talked about. We talked about amending the composite profile if need
Right.
be. And I think we talked about consent. I think you
Yeah,
and
we talked about consent, that at the very least you would want to get verbal consent, but most importantly, you want to document it in your report and to explain what the person consented to. It's not enough to
yes,
just say they consented.
right.
Yeah, yeah. And we talked about the different types of impairments to consider: physical, psychological, cognitive. In some cases, you'll have to dig further. You may need other reports, other assessments done to verify what exactly are the impairments. It's not enough to just rely on subjective information, what the client tells you. And okay, so, and we talked about TSA software, its strengths and limitations. People have preferences. Some prefer to mostly do manually, others will use a tool like this software, where it's important to be aware of its limitations.
I'll just finish with a quick story. I had a
Yeah.
customer I talked to this week, and they said, yeah, our case managers were using this software, but we've decided that it might just be better to refer out to have the experts do these. And I said, yeah, a win for vocational rehabilitation. So there's one tiny little win there. And, little by little, we can forge ahead in this profession if we all kind of stick to our guidelines and our ethical principles and
Yep.
work with our customers to help them to get the best results for their
Yeah, I really think so. And that's the point of these types of educational sessions, these webinars, is to really highlight what are the sound methods to be used, what's endorsed by our college or study guides or other manuals. And I mean, both of us, we've been on this review committee, right, for TSAs. So
Yep.
we've seen all kinds of reports, and that will be material for another day.
That's right.
So I want to thank you, Jennifer, for joining me today. We had a great conversation, and I look forward to the next time.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Francois, for having me and giving me a chance to share on this most important topic. I hope people got something out of this. Thanks so much.
Thank you again. Take care.